The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, music, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans who have been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity have succeeded. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Conrad Muhammad, the hip-hop minister. Welcome to African American Legends today.
Thank you for having me, Mr.
See,
Brown.
the thing is so intriguing.
Yes.
What is a hip-hop minister?
Well, you know, interestingly enough, when I was first referred to as the hip-hop minister, it was by my friend, then my nemesis, Peter Noel at the Village Voice. And it was sort of an attack on me because I was so young. I took over the ministry at Mosque Number 7 at 26 years old. And
the
so
famous
he said,
Mosque Number 7.
Yes, where Malcolm X had been and Minister Farrakhan. And he said, this hip-hop minister. And I ran from the term initially because many of my parishioners were older and I wanted to show them that I could handle the position. But then I thought about it and I said, I'm really blessed to be 26, 27, now 37 years old, a member of the hip-hop generation, but instead of a rapper or a music producer, I'm a hip-hop minister.
Okay, now tell us about hip-hop.
Yes.
Hip-hop has a varied interpretation in various segments of the community, and it's young.
Yes.
So therefore, people like myself and some of my peers might not totally understand it, although I think I understand, I certainly identify.
Well, there are two points that I think are important. That I distinguish the hip-hop generation and that question from hip-hop itself. Hip-hop is a musical art form that was produced in this generation. But the young people in the high schools and colleges from South Central Los Angeles to Harlem and the South Bronx and the East Bronx where hip-hop started, and all around the country, that generation can be euphemistically referred to as the hip-hop generation, such as the baby boomers or the civil rights generation. So the next great generation is the hip-hop generation. And that's where you can look at people like Jesse Jackson Jr., I call him the hip-hop congressman. Harold Ford Jr., who I went to college with, is a hip-hop congressman. Even Niger Ennis has joined the act, and now he's calling himself the hip-hop conservative. So if you could appreciate it from that perspective. But the music is a brilliant art form that was started here in New York by young people.
In the Bronx.
In the Bronx.
When I was president of Bronx Community College in the mid-'70s, the rap was just beginning.
Just starting, that's right.
And fortunately, we were able to have some of those students at our college.
Yes,
and some of the rappers who later became famous actually were students at Bronx Community College.
Yes, that's right.
Something I'm really very proud of because we sort of opened the door to let people express themselves. Now, some of the so-called negative things, miscegenation and so on, we don't identify with.
Right.
But I'm particularly interested in the message that the hip-hop musicians and hip-hop generation are sending.
Well, I'm glad you raised that point because, you know, the interesting thing about hip-hop, when people like Africa Bambaataa and DJ Kool Herc and all of the great originators or pioneers of hip-hop that were in the Bronx at that time, these young men, they're now in their 40s, they founded rap as an alternative to negativity. They had seen their friends die in the gang violence. Africa Bambaataa was in a gang. And he's a brilliant leader, and many of them said, we've got to give young people an alternative to the negativity. Only later comes the negative rap and the gangsterism. We'll get into that. But that has more to do with the music industry really taking this really organic art form that these young people created and corrupting it. And we'll get into that. But the music is diverse. And I think that's an important point, that when you talk about rap music, there is a diversity of rap music, from the very conscious and insightful and soulful rap artists that can make you think and cry and are quite brilliant and wax eloquently, poetically, to the profane. And I think it's the profane that unfortunately has become very commercially successful in recent years. And I think that while, as you know, as a former minister of Mosque Number 7, who's worked with people in the worst ghettos in the country, I'm not at all squeamish about anything from the streets. That has been my career, working with those in prison who have come out of prison and tried to reform their lives. So I'm not squeamish about any of this stuff. But what concerns me is crime on the street is generally practiced due to a lack of alternatives and a lack of opportunity. Crime that's perpetuated in the studio with multi-millions of dollars and corporations behind it is, I think, excessive and dangerous to our people, and we have to speak out against it because we're influencing a whole generation of young people.
That's a very interesting insight, because that brings together the religious and the musical and the philosophical and the political. It's often said that everything is political.
Yes.
Religion is political, music is political, sports is political, and you just highlighted that particular point. But let's go back to the music itself.
Yes.
The rhyming, the offbeat. I grew up in the jazz generation. We had our particular kind of music, and our parents didn't particularly like what we were doing.
Absolutely.
And so now I try to understand the new music, which may or may not appeal to me and others, still has a rhythm to it, has a beat to it, has a message to it. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, I just had this conversation with a good friend of mine, Wynton Marsalis, recently, and one of the things that is so interesting about this music and what makes it so vibrant is that the young people that started this music did not have musical training.
That's right.
The interesting thing about all other musical art forms is that there had to be a level of training and proficiency. You had to play an instrument, or you had to have a gift or a talent to sing. This music is the first music where young people took music that had already been made and very artfully and brilliantly meshed that with the spoken word, the poetry that is contemporary and that is new. And as you have pointed out, it at times can be very melodic and at times uses discord very brilliantly to make some of what I would say are some of the most profound musical statements today. I don't think R&B and soul today, for the most part, produces the level of profound music that rap music does. And, of course, at one point, rap music was just seen as sort of it was just seen as a sidebar to the music industry. But now it really drives the music industry.
Well, not only does it drive the music industry, it drives the fashion industry, it drives advertising.
Absolutely.
You see advertisements that are created for the general population, the white population, Latino population, including hip-hop moves, hip-hop clothing. By the way, what about hip-hop clothing? How does that reflect a genre?
Again, we've seen how young people from urban areas in New York have affected the entire fashion industry. When you go to Milan and Paris and London, all of the major fashion houses have been affected by this urban dress. And again, it permeates not only American society. You can go to any mall in America, and typically where young whites in the Midwest and in the western parts of the country, away from the urban areas, would dress differently from urban youth. Today, all the youth dress the same, and it's not limited to America. You can go to Japan, you can go to China, you can go to Africa, and all over Europe. Hip-hop is the dominant cultural influence among youth in the world today.
Now, that reflects itself in clothing.
Yes.
You and I have typically Western clothing, shirt, tie, and so on.
Yes.
But in the hip-hop, you have open clothes, freedom, looseness, etc.
Right.
Is that really related to the music, or is that really related to the fact that many of these folks started with little and used what they had to develop a presentation?
Yes, well, I think it refers more to the youthful nature of hip-hop. I mean, Russell Simmons is nearly 43 years old, 44 years old, but he walks around, he'll go to a formal in his own clothes, but he's selling clothes.
Right.
And that's the one of the great things about what he and Sean Puffy Combs are doing. They have clothes now in Bloomingdale's. They have clothes now that have major fashion shows, are being showcased all over the world. So again, it may have started just with the baggy clothes, but now they're selling mink coats, suits, ties, and that's a great thing that urban young people have now said to the world, we're here, we not only want to be consumers, but we also want to be the producers and sellers, and that's a very positive thing.
Well, let's talk about your career.
Yes.
You were a minister in the nation.
Yes.
You've gone to college. You are now speaking out for young people.
Yes.
How has your career developed, and where do you see it going?
Well, you know, I started out as a college student, and I became the national youth and student spokesman for the Nation of Islam when I was at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I went on to become the minister of Mosque Number 7. And one of the great things about my ministry is that I was blessed at a time during what they call the golden age of hip-hop to be the minister in Harlem. And the mosque on 125th Street and 5th Avenue at that time was right around the corner from a all-night clothing store that used to sell Gucci and Fendi suits that Gucci and Fendi didn't even know they made. And that's where Mike Tyson got into a 2 o'clock in the morning fight with Mitch Blood Green. It was called Dapper Dan's. And it's there that I met Mike Tyson and many of the rappers when we would recruit them to come into the mosque. And we started there, and we began to gain a reputation and trust among many of the young people, and we began to engage this hip-hop community. They would come to the mosque, because many of them didn't go to regular churches, so they would come and get their spiritual guidance. Then we started doing marriages and even some funerals. And then when some of these rap wars started, they would come to the mosque and say, Minister Conrad, would you help us resolve these conflicts? So in 1998, after I had gone to graduate school up at Harvard, I left and resigned from the Nation and came back and said, what we need today is a movement that speaks to and for the hip-hop generation politically. And that's how we formed the organization, A Movement for Change. And that's an acronym for Conscious Hip-Hop Activism Necessary for Global Empowerment.
Let's hear that again.
Conscious hip-hop activism necessary for global empowerment. In fact, we have a website, and they can see it on the screen. It's www.movementforchange.org, but change has 2 H's. Just think of hip-hop.
That's very, very... Now, talk about young people.
Sure.
This is the 21st century.
Yes.
African Americans through the 19th century, 20th century, finally around 1964 gained full citizenship as a result of King and the protests and Malcolm and all the rest of us.
Yes.
Now in the 21st century, African Americans still represent about 13% of the population.
Yes.
They go into major corporations. They can become secretaries of state, college presidents. How does this impact on those young African Americans who are still sort of left out from this largesse that we have developed over this time?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think coming out of the philosophy of the Nation and the philosophy of Booker T. Washington, I see tremendous opportunity. I think Malcolm X and Dr. King never would have dreamed of a day when a young person could go into a studio and say anything that they wanted to say and earn $2 or $3 million. I don't think they ever dreamed that they would see that. So I think one of the things that we have to do with our young people today is teach them and help them to acknowledge and accept the progress and the success of the movement. You didn't fail, Mr. Brown. Malcolm X didn't fail. Dr. King, Frederick Douglass, Jackie Robinson. Your struggle produced a day when we could be the things that we want to be. And I think as long as we teach our young people to not engage in making excuses, because let's face it, I don't care how difficult the circumstances are in our lives today. If you truly work hard and if you truly focus on being successful, you can make it. And I think in our community, we've got to start teaching that lesson to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And if you don't have bootstraps, sew together a few pieces of leather and make bootstraps. I think this is the message that we need to take to our young people today, because it's so important. We've got to move beyond the culture of failure and excuse making.
What some people call the culture of victimhood.
Culture of victimhood.
On the other hand, even in today's wonderful world,
yes,
there's a glass ceiling that African Americans can't penetrate.
Yes.
In Major League Baseball, we only have 2 black managers.
Yes.
We have very few people who run studios. So there is another hurdle. Now, it's true that the impediments such as segregation and totally poor education have been moved away somewhat. So it's up to folks like you and your generation to help plot this course. And one of the things I'm concerned about is that sometimes when you begin to move ahead, the competition, which is natural in the human organism, causes us to end up fighting each other rather than moving ahead. So how do you think we should address that?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right. While tremendous progress is made, and I think I so much focus on young people that are making a choice between whether or not they're going to sell drugs or engage in criminal activity or work at McDonald's or go to college until they can do better, that you're right. When you get to the higher rungs of society, there are all types of impediments. But I just want to make sure that our young people know that there's enough opportunity that you don't have to engage in criminal activity. And then we'll fight those other fights in the courts. Politically, we must continue to fight them. Obviously, we still face things like police brutality. I've gone to jail and led marches around that issue. But I do think, Mr. Brown, that there is absolutely a crisis among our young people. And I think that when an older person or a person with a certain degree of education talks about the limitations, they are going to challenge those limitations in a constructive way. But I think that sometimes our young people, when they talk about limitations, we have to clarify for them that those limitations don't force them to do things that ultimately are going to be harmful to them, i.e. landing them in jail or death. And I think those are 2 different kinds of conversations.
You're certainly correct about that, because that gets into the class phenomenon as well, those who have achieved and those who haven't achieved. And one of the things that has held African Americans together is that we recognized, or people of African descent, that we're all in the same boat.
Absolutely.
That all you have to do is try to go get a taxi cab somewhere and just ordinary clothes, and you find that happen. But on the other hand, that does not deter you or I or anyone else from moving ahead in one's profession. Going back to hip-hop music, how can hip-hop music help to get that message across?
Well, I tell you, if you want to reach young people today, they don't read Time magazine, they don't read Newsweek, and in fact, if you want to reach young people, they read Vibe magazine, they read The Source magazine, they read other hip-hop publications, XXL, and I'm talking about young people from Bedford Avenue to Howard University to Harvard University. This cultural phenomenon is the vehicle to take messages to young people. And that's why I'm happy to see a lot of the older generation, people such as yourself, beginning to recognize the importance of this vehicle. And I think that hip-hop will play a great role in communicating whatever we want to young people, because it is what they eat, drink, and sleep in some manifestation or form of that culture. And that's why I think it's so critical that the messages that they get in that culture be, at least if they're provocative messages, nothing wrong with that. We've embraced Public Enemy, KRS-One, many groups that have been provocative, but they should not be fatalistic. We should not allow our young people to get a fatalistic message.
And they should not denigrate women.
Absolutely. See, I challenged some of the rappers recently, and for the first time in my career, I got into a tiff with some, not the artists, mind you, but some of the executives. Because my position is hip-hop has always defied conventions. It's always challenged the status quo. Chuck D said it's the CNN of the urban reality. And I agree with that. But what has happened in recent years, where these corporations have come up with a formula, major corporations, multinational corporations, that have said it's a quick fix to put out negative raps where women are called, excuse me for saying this, bitches and hoes, and I hate to use that kind of language, but you almost can't describe it. And sometimes I think people in your generation need to be shocked into really hearing what some of the negative stuff is saying, because then you'll be called to arms. And I think I'm going to take some of this music to some of these preachers, because they need to hear this. People like Hugh Price of the Urban League, Kwesi and Fume of the NAACP. Between the preachers and these organizations, this represents the first line of defense for the dignity of African Americans. And if we can protest D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation, if we can protest other stereotypical images, Jesse Jackson just took a major automaker to task for a small cartoon that was questionable as to whether or not it denigrated African Americans. So I'm saying to the corporations, and we should be together on this, you simply cannot put out stereotypical images and make millions of dollars. And I say to our young blacks that are putting it out, we love you. We're not trying to stop you from making money. But as a people, we have to draw a line on some things when it comes to our dignity.
You know, as you talk, and we talk about the future, which is where we want to go, it also reminds me that in the past, the history of African Americans, we've had some great writers, some great musicians, some great philosophers. We've had Langston Hughes.
Absolutely.
And we've had Richard Wright, and we've had James Baldwin, and we've had Maya Angelou, and we've had Toni Morrison.
Absolutely. So the list goes on and on.
So it goes on and on. I was somewhat interested in Cornel West. The professor decided to do a hip-hop piece. If you read some of Langston Hughes, and the rhythm of that, that's almost hip-hop. And one of the problems when you focus on the future and the present, you forget the fact that the past has a lot of things to teach us and tell us.
Well, Mr. Brown, as you know, with young people, not only do they forget the distant past sometimes, but you have many of the pioneers of rap who started rap, who the young people don't listen to today. And I think it behooves our young people, it would do them well to not only look back to Langston Hughes and all of the greats of the past. You mentioned James Baldwin. There's so many eloquent writers and the political figures, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dr. King, W.E.B. Du Bois, but also just listen to Africa Bambaataa. Just listen to KRS-One. Just listen to all of the greats in hip-hop that gave us this art form, and they were continuing this great continuity of black genius and black brilliance. And I'm sorry, people get mad at me if they want to, but opening up a CD, calling black women bitches and hoes and niggers, that is not continuing the brilliance of our people. And I say to our elder generation, those like Professor Cornel West and Reverend Sharpton and Reverend Jackson and all of Kwesi and Fume, all of the older generation of leaders, if you're going to deal with our generation, be our parents, don't be our friends. I think the 60s civil rights generation has always had issues about whether they should follow Dr. Spock in raising the next generation and be our friend, or whether they should be our parents. And I think that it is not criticizing black youth to tell them that that kind of negativity is wrong, because at the end of the day, when some of these current rappers' music can be found at the 99-cent closeout bin at a record store, when you find the top hits today for 99 cents in a closeout bin, the dignity of African American people will still be here it'll still be important, and we'll still have a need to preserve it and fight for it. And I think it's worth it to mix it up with some of our young people, to challenge them to use that art form to take us to another level. Lauryn Hill, one of the most brilliant and beautiful examples of hip hop. She says, music is supposed to inspire. So how come we're not getting any higher? That's a profound lyric.
Or now, in your role,
Yes.
the Movement for Change,
Yes.
hip hop minister, how do you propose to carry this message? A very strong
Yes.
and direct message. How do you propose to carry this
Well,
message?
we are taking it to churches, community centers, and also we have regular scheduled forums at the Harlem State Office Building. We also have our campaign for dignity. And again, I would like for people that are interested in finding out more about us to visit our website. The address is www.movementforchange.org. And again,
change has
two H's. Think of hip hop, and it's one word. But we do want the preachers and the organizational leaders to invite us to come in and talk to their young people, because it's an important message. You know, we've registered tens of thousands of young people to vote, and we've actually run candidates from the hip hop generation and supported candidates to elected office. We have a 6-point program. And we believe that this 6-point program is a very complete and sort of total addressing of the issues that will help our generation to be successful. Just quickly, first is spirituality. I don't care what your religion is, but you got to have a spiritual base. You can't go anywhere without that. You turn to drugs, alcohol if you don't have that. Despair. Strong families. We got to promote strong family structure. Again, positive cultural references. Formal education, encouraging the pursuit of it, economic literacy, and greater political involvement and political participation. That's what we believe is the formula for success.
I think it is a formula for success. Today on African American Legends, we've been talking with Conrad Muhammad, the hip hop minister leading us into the next generation.